Hi, and welcome to the fifth podcast for KV518. This is Mark Price, and this podcast looks particularly at the nature of evolving professionality. And by that I mean how our professional identities as individuals, but also our identities as part of a community, how those change over time. Just as an intro to that, a friend of mine a while ago asked me one of those personality quizzes. And if you want to take this for yourself, I'll suggest a point to which you pause the podcast and just jot down a few ideas. Anyway, if I can remember it rightly, what she said was you have to think of your three favourite animals and what is it about those animals that you particularly like or admire or whatever. So what qualities, what attributes of those animals do you are the reason why you've chosen them. Okay, so this is the point at which if you want to do it for yourself, pause the podcast, jot down your three favourite animals and why. What is it about those animals, their qualities, their attributes, whatever. Okay, so the personality test, if you like, and there's a huge kind of health warning about this, so I don't take it too seriously. But as far as I can remember it goes along the lines of this: that your favourite animal, your first choice, is how you would like. How you would like others to see you. So how you would like other people to see you is what's represented by your first choice. Your second choice is how actually other people do see you. And the third choice, your third choice of animal, is your true quality as a person, your true kind of attribute or quality. If you are at all interested in that, mine were, if I can remember, a jaguar as being how I would like people to see me, a badger in terms of how people actually do see me, and a swift as in terms of my true character, if you like. Anyway, that's just a bit of fun, if you like, as a side. But the notion of kind of thinking about what attributes define who we are professionally and the nature of our professionality is the focus for this podcast. So moving on, the first thing to kind of just clarify is to talk about the difference between acting professionally and being a professional. And by acting professionally, we might mean some of the things that we probably quite normally associate with being professional, if you like, keeping your word, presenting yourself in an appropriate manner, and so on. And that I'm saying that's significantly different. I want to differentiate between that kind of acting professionally and the notion of being a professional, the professional identity that you have as a youth worker, as an early years practitioner, as an LSA, whoever you might be. So what is it defines you in terms of who you are professionally? And that aspect of professional identity, as I hope you've realised by now, is part of the focus of these reflective practice modules over the years 1 and 2 of the course, and then going ahead into year 3, the extended module that underpins all the way through year 3 of this course. So there are many different definitions in terms of what we mean by a profession. And the definition I've given you here is actually quite has been around for a while now. I think it's still useful though, and then it does define a number of elements which potentially are useful for us in thinking about ourselves as professions and the profession that we belong to. I'll just run through those. So the first one, this notion of an altruistic orientation. In other words, we're doing something which is for the good of society. And one of our motivations and purposes behind our profession is that we offer something, we provide something of use, of value to society. Second area, that the profession is underpinned by a particular knowledge, particular professional knowledge, and that being a professional in that area means that you have to have that area of professional knowledge. We might share it with other professions, but no other profession shares the complete range of knowledge and skills that we, in a sense, possess in our own profession. So each profession has its own set of knowledge and related skills. That there is a code of practice, if you like, that is particular to each profession, and that code of practice, that regulatory code of ethics, emphasises values such as respect for the confidentiality of what I've referred to as the client, the learner, the patient, whoever it might be, the person that we're working with. That the profession that we're part of is acknowledged and has the sanction of the community at large. In other words, we're recognised and perceived by the broader community, and that there is a level of qualification or recognition that we need to gain in order to be part of that profession. So those attributes which define a profession are always useful in terms of thinking about the profession that we belong to, that you belong to, but also other professions that we might work with. And if we use that kind of definition, we can see that some professions are much more clearly defined than others. And one of the things that's happened over more recent years is the way that professions have evolved, that new professions have developed, and that sometimes the boundaries between professions become blurred. And it's that aspect of individual professionalism and then how that relates to interprofessionalism that we're starting to explore here. Okay, so that takes us back to the animal metaphor, if you like. And I've been giving you three examples of animals here to illustrate the way in which professions as a whole, but also as individuals within those professions, how they evolve and change. I'll just kind of talk you through these three animals to illustrate that, and then perhaps talk about a particular example. So let's start with a chameleon. One of the features of the chameleon, of course, is it's able to change its colour. It changes its colour to blend in with its surroundings. Now, some professions have a very clear identity. It is fixed, and no matter where that profession is situated, or no matter where that an individual works in that professional field, it's a very clearly defined professional role. Others have a particular particular way of working, which means they adapt to the environment they're in, and working in one context in that professional role. If they move into a different context, they might have a very different professional identity. They might shift their role quite considerably. And as a youth worker, I can remember particularly needing to adapt in this way, that if I worked in a school setting within the school timetable, that will be a very different professional focus, a professional kind of being, than if I was working as a detached youth worker on the street in the evening, that I would kind of adapt my practices and will probably look physically as well quite different in terms of the way I dressed. So that's probably an example of the chameleon type role, of how we adapt our role. The duck-billed platypus on the bottom left is a really interesting animal. If any of you ever chose a duck-billed platypus as one of your favourite animals, it has features of being a mammal in that it's warm-blooded, but it lays eggs, which is very similar to perhaps like a reptile, but it also has features like a beak that are more similar that we might associate with almost like a bird. Hence the phrase, the duck-billed platypus. So it's an animal which kind of borrows or has adapted physical attributes relating to from a number of different professions. And I think this is particularly common, or particularly kind of reflected in some of the newer professions. For instance, family support workers borrow from social work. They also borrow from education welfare officers and education welfare service, and they also borrow from youth workers as well. So we might see that some particularly emerging professions are perhaps what we might call a hybrid professional identity. And then the third animal that I presented here, the frog and the tadpoles, and of course before that the frog spawn, shows how professions and individuals in professions evolve over time, and how, if we look back historically for a particular profession, we can see how it's changed and morphed into something new, but also how individuals within that profession field themselves might change and evolve over time. So I've given you these three animals in a sense to illustrate the way that professional identities and roles, both for individuals and for the profession as a whole, evolve over time. And so an aspect of that I just wanted to highlight is the idea of what we're going to call a boundary spanner. Someone that is able to span the boundaries between professional roles. And I think that is probably quite relevant to many of us working in professional fields which are perhaps as not clearly defined as more recognisable professions. So in other words, if, again, going back to my own background as a youth worker, I think this is also true for learning support assistants, teaching assistants and early years practitioners as well, that at times, and I think particularly in relation to working with young people, children, young people and parents and families, we have to be able to span different professional identities and also enable others to understand those professional boundaries and perhaps cross them and be able to navigate them at the same time. That quality of being able to talk with other professionals, talk with the public, and be able to, in a sense, use the phrase here, promote a dialogue which transcends the familiar limitations of categorical thinking, is a very fine quality, I think, of the professionals that we're able to kind of develop. And it might be worth reflecting on those situations that you've been in where you felt you've had to span professional boundaries in order to work effectively with the children, the young people and the families that you work with. And this reference, in a sense, summarises some of those qualities that relate to boundary spanning in terms of professionalism. And again, I think it's quite useful to reflect on those and reflect on your own development. In what way have you had to negotiate managing different levels, different roles, different accountabilities, different motivations? And that way of working is something I think that many of us have become more and more used to. But actually, it's both a fine skill to be able to have, but potentially can cause us problems at times or can create tensions where we're trying to fulfill a number of different roles, a number of different expectations as a result of spanning those boundaries. So I think there's what we might say, a bit of a double-edged sword about that quality as well. But it's worth reflecting on in terms of your own professional identity and the way that the profession you're part of is evolving, is developing over time. And so thinking about these issues, the way the professions change, the way the professions evolve, the way that individual practitioners that we, in a sense, are required to evolve and change over time, it kind of contributes to or is part of a broader trend about the way that professions are changing. I think particularly in terms of the earlier part of the new century under New Labour, this was particularly common, that if you go back to the Every Child Matters Green Paper and development of practice following that, a number of new professions were developed. I think perhaps there's a kind of a pulling back from some of those developments in more recent times. But what has become clear is the whole concept of professional recognition has, what I've called here, become contested. In other words, it's sometimes becoming more variable within our field how different professionals are recognised and acknowledged in different fields. So this notion of professional recognition isn't perhaps as straightforward as it used to be. If you think, for example, within the field of teaching, that because of particularly the development of free schools and academies, the need to be qualified as a teacher has become slightly diffused. That in some schools now there's not the same pressure to become qualified at the outset, or the qualification may come along later on in your career. So this notion about professional recognition, I think, is clearly part of our agenda in the degree programs that we're offering here at Brighton, but we also recognise is likely to evolve and continue to evolve over time, and is a field that hopefully, as academics, that we're part of and contributing to as well, in terms of examining with a number of groups and individuals the way that those professions evolve. So thinking about this particular module, KV518, I'm thinking about the assignment and the project that you're undertaking as part of this module. As we move towards the end of year 2 and into year 3, we're wanting to highlight how the approach to what we're calling professional inquiry, in other words, you undertaking research into your own field and becoming more and more familiar about research undertaken by others in the field that you're part of, helps develop and reshape those notions of professionality. So this notion about being professional is never static. It continues to evolve, and it continues to evolve by the research and inquiry that we're part of. In the sense that we're all part of that shaping professionality. And as a pub quiz bonus question, can you name what video, one of my favourites, that image is taken from? So to conclude with, and perhaps thinking about the extended fourth reflective practice recording that you submit as part of the KV518 assignment task, what are the implications for you? What are the implications for your developing professional status, the knowledge, the training qualifications that you're working on, the focus of your practice, the level of autonomy that you have as a practitioner and the amount of recognition you gain? And thinking about where, particularly over the next couple of years, but even beyond that, your own developing professionality might be formed. How we continue to, over the course of our life, evolve professionally. I think if we look back into previous generations where people entered into an occupation or even a profession, those identities were relatively static. People didn't change their role, change their vocation, change their occupation, change their profession in the same way that we tend to now. And perhaps if we're thinking and further into the future, we'll be looking at how to support young people having a much more fluid approach or even mobile approach to professionality, that we prepare people for their professional identities changing over time.